Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Green. I'm going to be providing some opening remarks on our response to the Rouleau Commission. Then I'll be able to take some questions. It was about a year ago that Ottawa was occupied here by the convoy. And before I get into my remarks, I just want to begin by situating what the impacts were on the community. People were afraid to leave their homes. People were harassed. Businesses were shut down. Workers were unable to work. And the government was forced to make a decision to declare the invocation of the Act. And over the last 12 months, we have been working both in the House and the Joint Committee alongside the Rouleau Commission to begin to unpack exactly what happened and whether or not those measures met the threshold. And I think what we found in the Commission's report, and I want to thank Justice Rouleau and their Commission. You know, this is a comprehensive report. This is a detailed account. This was a tremendous amount of resources put to get, in a year's time, a definitive opinion on whether or not the threshold was met. And in the report, it is clear that Justice Rouleau believes that at the highest standards, the thresholds for the invocation of the Act were met. And in reading it this morning, I think one of our key takeaways is that this report should serve as a warning to Canadians about what happens when there is a failure at all levels of government, in policing, and in societal cohesion. And as New Democrats at the time, when we were faced with a decision on whether or not to support this government, we were doing so based on the facts and the observations that we had, like many Canadians across the country, which I think you'll find were corroborated extensively throughout this Commission's report. We certainly, take no joy in where we're at here today, and I think it's our responsibility as legislators to move forward with the recommendations that were contained within the report, and in the conclusions of our Joint Committee, hopefully prepare our own parliamentary report back to the House of Commons and the Senate to contemplate the amendments that might be necessary to ensure that this Emergency Act does not need to be invoked in similar situations. I think what's most telling, particularly, is Rouleau's commentary on the failure of policing and public safety. Their recommendations contained within the report, I would say what's most stark for me is that, and I think many Canadians when they read it, is that most of the recommendations that Rouleau has in the report, most Canadians I think would assume that those processes would already be in place. But of course, this report is an indictment on the failures of the multiple levels of policing to coordinate a response to the growing unrest and the disruption and ultimately the harm caused to citizens across the country. Justice Rouleau made a very key distinction that while it is true, relatively speaking, there was no violence, that the harm that was caused to the residents and the economy constituted a justification for the invocation of the Act. And so now our work as parliamentarians moving forward is to ensure that we remedy the Act in a way that creates clear definitions and has better oversight and governance with policing, and ultimately to better address the grievances that are put before us so that peaceful protests don't descend into the lawlessness that was experienced here in Ottawa and across the country. I'm happy to answer any questions. Oh, sorry, I will allow my good friend Daniel to...
Bonjour tout le monde. Nous sommes ici pour répondre au rapport final du commission Rouleau. Puis je vais commencer juste en remerciant juge Rouleau de tout son travail. Son rapport nous ramène à février 2022 ici à Ottawa, mais aussi aux villes sur la frontière comme Coutts, Alberta, Emerson, au Manitoba, Windsor ici à l'Ontario, où il y avait vraiment un état de chaos qui a commencé avec un démonstration, puis à cause d'une réponse lente et ineffectueuse, c'est développé jusqu'au point que l'invocation des mesures d'urgence était nécessaire. De notre part, nous concentrons sur les recommandations par rapport aux lacunes qu'on a vues par rapport aux gestions de situation de la part des gouvernements qui ont été impliqués et aussi des agences de police. Alors, nous prenons ces recommandations très au sérieux et nous voyons notre travail maintenant comme mettre en œuvre ces recommandations pour que nous ne trouvons pas encore dans une situation où une telle mesure ou suite de mesures sont nécessaires. Merci.
Thank you. Happy to answer any questions that you all might have.
One of the comments about the delisting mechanism that needed to be there when they're freezing financial resources, that's a failing. So, how much of a failing is that? If this is something that really took away the rights for people to get to their money and so on, their financial assets, is that a violation perhaps the government should try and make amends for in some way?
Well, I think Rouleau was pretty clear that, by and large, the measures that were invoked by the government met the threshold and were effective, with some exceptions. And the Commission's report was also fairly clear in articulating the appropriate balance using the Oakes test on the Charter on proportionality. And I think, given the flood of an influx of money that came in both through digital assets and through direct deposits, that the government, would have to take that particular failure into account, as would the whole House, in our recommendations moving forward, and make sure that there's clear definitions and thresholds on the financial side of those disclosures. But I think that Rouleau was fairly clear that whatever limitations were put forward, in his opinion, fully met the 3 points of the Oakes test.
Do you see where the breakdown occurred when he talked about, political levels of government across all levels not being able to properly coordinate, putting aside, partisan differences to respond to the protest here? Yeah,
I mean, certainly there's a large body of evidence within the Commission's report that is an indictment on the failure of public safety. And that would include policing, and that would include all levels of government. He made specific reference to, and I think you've just referenced this, the partisan nature in which he called federalism a failure. And I thought that that was a pretty significant statement for Justice Rouleau to make, and in doing that identified just the lack of presence that the Ontario provincial government had under Doug Ford, their reluctance to be at the tables for integrated command, and ultimately even their reluctance to participate in the Commission's review, which made it difficult for him to then provide any type of opinion on why they made the decisions that they made. But it's to be noted that the province invoked their Emergency Act. It's to be noted that there were significant governance problems locally here in Ottawa between the OPS, and there's a pretty extensive body of information within the Commission's report that talks about the breakdown of policing locally. And if you'll recall, Perrin Mbidi in his early testimony, both at the Joint Committee, the Joint House Review, and in the Commission, I think demonstrated that the Act as it was written never contemplated this type of failure of policing. And so that even if it's true that there were existing laws in place that could have been utilized to prevent this, to de-escalate it, and to dissipate it, ultimately what occurred here, and it's evidence within the Commission's report, is that, particularly to the convoy occupation here in Ottawa, is that there was an inability to write bylaw tickets, make arrests, press charges, and that is what resulted into the descent into lawlessness. And I would respect that Justice Rouleau would use his words very carefully, but this notion of lawlessness appears in the Commission's report multiple times, and I think is indicative of what everybody experienced right here in Ottawa.
Where do we go forward from here in reforming or changing the police service? What do you think the next steps need to be?
Well, there are various recommendations within the Commission's report that speak to some of the chain of command failures and the governance failures at all levels of government, including local policing, provincial policing, and the RCMP. As New Democrats, I think we've called for a broader Royal Commission on policing because we don't look at public safety as just being about police. We look at it as being integral to what the experience of the community is. I'll reference that a turning point that was cited was the Battle of Billings Bridge. The fact that residents had to take to the streets to try to find a remedy in their own communities, I think further speaks to the failure of all levels of government and was referenced there. And I think moving forward, it's going to be incumbent on us to maybe perhaps go beyond the scope of Rouleau's recommendations, beyond the structural and systemic breakdowns in policing, and have a broader conversation around the state of policing under a Royal Commission, which hasn't happened since 1962.
Yeah, do you think there needs to be a better national framework for when provinces adopt their own provincial police services? Because we're seeing other provinces wanting to do something similar as Ontario. Does this kind of heed warning to other provinces?
Well, this commission report is absolutely a warning on multiple different levels, and I had addressed how it was a warning to civil society in terms of the notion of the breakdown of cohesion and the way in which misinformation and disinformation fueled this. As it relates to policing, the Rouleau Commission's report details at extent the ways in which that chain of command broke down. And while it identified individual actors within the breakdown of the chain of command, I think it's important to note that this was a comprehensive breakdown of the chain of command in policing and its inability to integrate proper intelligence, which was open source. For the first time, we heard in testimony that this was people who were absolutely telegraphing what their moves were. We understood that locally, there was information that went to the hotels that they did not plan to leave, and yet the local police didn't heed those warnings. And so all of these different factors, I think, need to be addressed in a nationwide Royal Commission on Policing that would look at the integration of all three levels of services, including our intelligence agencies federally.
Can I just ask you again about the political, discord? These different levels of government unwilling to really work together at this problem, not able to put partisanship aside.
Yeah.
We're dealing at a time where there's potentially, this war in Ukraine, there's spy balloons floating over top. Like, how concerned should Canadians be that their elected leaders failed to put aside their partisan differences for something that amounted to a national emergency?
Well, I think that's well documented, and the other thing that was documented within the report was the media's role as well in exacerbating some of those divisions and the ways in which these stories have been reported. There's extensive information and evidence within the Commission's report around the use of social media and disinformation, and I would agree. There's a segment in the report that highlights the Prime Minister's comments towards the convoy occupants as being generalized to the entire movement. And I want to make it clear that we acknowledge that the movement, the occupation started off as a lawful protest and descended into lawlessness, and that there were people who came here to express their democratically held rights to protest. I believe that to be true. We believe that to be true. I think what we need to do as elected officials is look at ways in which we communicate in these instances of a national emergency and do better. That is identified within the report. And, as New Democrats, we're willing to do that, and we're willing to embark on working with all parties to ensure that the amendments create better definitions, clearer thresholds, and better integrated chains of command, so that we ultimately, the goal, I hope, for all parties, is that we never end up back in this situation again.
Having read what you read, can I just have two questions? Having read what you read, any reason, is there any way Blaikie could have stayed on, Commissioner Blaikie?
You know, I think it would be a mistake for anybody to personalize the failures of what happened to individual actors, and we've seen within the report references of people being scapegoated, and I think whatever happened with Commissioner Blaikie, you know, happened separate from what I read today. We need to have a comprehensive review, a Royal Commission on Policing, and we need to look at the systems and the structures, and we need to have an honest discussion around the ways in which there were multiple failures at multiple breakdowns at all levels of government. I think it would be unfair to place this at one person's feet, and you know, I'll leave whatever interpretations the commissioner had to her departure for herself to answer.
And I'll give you a break. Mr. Blaikie, can I just ask you a question? Today's a busy day, lots of news. We're also getting the government's just transition plan and legislation, something that the NDP called for. What do you make of the plan, and also what do you make of it being tabled on a Friday, where people probably won't be paying attention to it? It might not get the scrutiny that it deserves.
Well, obviously, as you know, we're here to talk about Judge Rouleau's report, and that's been certainly my focus for the morning. The reason why we have insisted on the government presenting a real plan for what the next stage of our economy looks like is globally we see many of our partners and allies trying to lower the carbon content of their own economies is because we don't want to see workers get left behind. And what we know for sure is that if we just sort of slow walk into the future without a very intentional plan for how Canada is going to be competitive in the new energy economy, it's workers that are going to suffer and it's workers that are going to get left behind. So I'll leave discussion of the details of the plan for another day, but just want to emphasize that yes, Canada does need a plan. We will see with time whether the government has risen adequately to the occasion. Well, and fair enough, but there's more than one thing coming out this Friday, and I think you know, this is a plan that speaks to the next generation economy of Canada. There's going to be lots of discussion about the plan and about what that economy looks like in the weeks, months, and years to come.
Do you think Trudeau could have been a better leader throughout all of this, helping unite the levels involved? Yes?